When Harold Mason opened his cabin door to find a massive white horse and two foals standing in the blizzard, he never imagined that letting these mysterious creatures into his home would unleash a power that would shatter his understanding of life, death, and the promises made by those who loved him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Harold Mason stood at his cabin door, watching the snow drift down from a pewter sky. Winter had come early to the mountains this year, with a vengeance that caught even the old-timers by surprise. 3 feet of snow had fallen in the past week alone, and the forecasters were calling for another storm system to hit by nightfall. Harold pulled his worn flannel jacket tighter around his thin frame and sighed. At 68, each winter seemed colder than the last, each storm more brutal. This small cabin that had been his home for over 4 decades creaked in protest as another gust of wind pushed against its weathered logs. Harold had built it with his own hands as a young man, full of dreams about the farm he would create in this secluded mountain valley. The land had been cheap then, too remote, too rugged for most folks, perfect for a stubborn young man with more determination than sense, as his late wife Martha used to say. Martha, the ache of her absence still felt fresh even though 3 winters had passed since she'd drawn her last breath in the bedroom just behind him. Cancer had taken her swiftly, mercifully, the doctors had said. Small comfort to the man left behind with nothing but memories and a failing farm. Harold squinted at the distant tree line, trying to make out the shapes emerging from the forest edge. Something was moving there. Something large. Probably just deer, he thought. Desperate for food in the deep snow. They'd been coming closer to the cabin lately, drawn by the small amount of hay he'd put out near the old barn. He couldn't afford to feed wildlife, not with his own resources dwindling, but he couldn't bear to watch anything starve. But as the shapes drew nearer, Harold realized these were no deer. His breath caught in his throat as the creatures emerged fully from the swirling snow. Horses. A magnificent white mare, tall and powerful, flanked by 2 small foals of the same pristine color. They moved with deliberate purpose through the knee-deep snow, heading directly toward his cabin. What in God's name? Harold muttered, rubbing his eyes to make sure they weren't playing tricks on him. Wild horses weren't unheard of in these mountains, descendants of escaped ranch stock that had adapted to the harsh environment over generations. But they typically avoided human habitation, especially in winter, when they retreated deeper into the protected valleys. Yet here they were, approaching his front door as if they'd been invited for Sunday dinner. The mare was massive, easily 17 hands high, with a flowing mane that whipped in the wind like spun silver. The foals, twins by the look of them, couldn't be more than a few months old, far too young to survive a mountain winter without shelter. As they drew closer, Harold could see that something was wrong. The mare moved with a slight limp, favoring her right front leg. The foals stayed close to their mother's flanks, their large eyes wide with what looked like fear or exhaustion. All 3 animals were thin, their white coats dull despite their majestic appearance. "Whoa there," Harold called out softly as the horses approached his porch. "Easy now." To his astonishment, the mare stopped directly in front of his cabin door, not 10 feet away. She raised her proud head and looked directly at Harold, her dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Then, to his further amazement, she nickered softly and pawed at the ground, as if asking for something. Harold had worked with horses in his younger days. The small farm had once boasted a modest stable, with 2 workhorses that helped plow the fields and pull the wagon to town. But that was long ago, before the arthritis in his joints made farm work impossible, before the economic realities of small-scale farming had forced him to sell off most of his land and animals. All that remained now was the cabin, a small vegetable garden that lay dormant under the snow, and a few chickens that barely produced enough eggs to keep him fed. "I've got nothing for you," Harold said apologetically. "Barely enough to feed myself these days." The mare nickered again, more insistently this time. One of the foals, bolder than its sibling, took a tentative step toward the porch, then stumbled in the deep snow. The sight of the struggling young horse tugged at something deep in Harold's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. "You can't stay out here," he found himself saying. "Storm's coming. You'll freeze to death, especially those little ones." As if understanding his words, the mare limped forward, coming right up to the edge of his porch. She lowered her head, gently nudging one of the foals toward the door of the cabin. The message was clear as day to Harold. "Help us." "You want to come inside?" Harold asked incredulously. "That's crazy. You're horses, for heaven's sake. You belong in a barn, not a house." But even as he spoke the words, Harold knew he couldn't turn them away. The old barn had partially collapsed last winter, making it unsafe for anything larger than the chickens. And with the temperature dropping and another storm approaching, leaving these animals outside would be a death sentence. "Martha would think I've lost my mind," Harold muttered, shaking his head. But Martha had also been the one who could never turn away a creature in need. How many injured birds and abandoned fawns had she nursed back to health over the years? "You win," he sighed, stepping back and pulling the door open wider. For a moment, nothing happened. The mare stood perfectly still, regarding the open door with what appeared to be caution. Then, with a grace that belied her size, she carefully navigated the 3 wooden steps up to the porch. At the threshold, she paused again, as if seeking final permission. "Come on, then," Harold encouraged, gesturing inside. "It ain't the Ritz, but it's warm." With a soft snort that sent clouds of vapor into the frigid air, the mare ducked her head and stepped into Harold Mason's cabin. The foals followed, pressing close to their mother's sides, their tiny hooves clicking on the wooden floor. Harold closed the door behind them, shutting out the biting wind and swirling snow. The cabin, which had always seemed too empty since Martha's passing, was suddenly full of life and warmth and the earthy smell of horses. "Well," Harold said to his unexpected guests, "I suppose we should get you dried off and see about that leg of yours." As he moved to get some old towels from a chest by the fireplace, Harold couldn't help but smile for the first time in months. Martha would have loved this, he thought. She would have called it a miracle. Little did Harold know just how right she would have been. Harold's cabin was modest. A main room with a stone fireplace, small kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to a bedroom and bathroom. The sudden presence of 3 horses made the space feel impossibly small. The mare's back nearly brushed the ceiling beams, and her massive body filled the center of the room. The foals huddled close to her, their eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar indoor environment. "Never thought I'd have horses in my living room," Harold muttered as he stoked the fire. Warmth radiated outward, and the horses seemed to appreciate it, turning slightly to allow the heat to reach their snow-dampened flanks. Harold approached the mare slowly, hands visible. "Let's have a look at that leg of yours, girl." The horse regarded him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, but didn't shy away when he knelt to examine her right foreleg. Years of farm work had taught Harold a thing or two about equine injuries, and his arthritic fingers gently probed the leg. "Looks like a sprain, maybe a small tear in the tendon," he diagnosed aloud. "Nothing broken, but you shouldn't be walking on it, especially not through deep snow." He glanced up at the mare. "What were you thinking, bringing your babies through a blizzard in your condition?" The mare nickered softly and lowered her head to nuzzle one of the foals. The message seemed clear to Harold. She'd had no choice. "Well, you're here now," he sighed, rising with difficulty as his knees protested. "Let me see what I can find for that leg." In the bathroom cabinet, Harold found an old elastic bandage from his own various injuries and a tube of horse liniment that had somehow survived the years since he'd owned working animals. Martha had been meticulous about never throwing away potentially useful items, a habit born from growing up during harder times. As he worked on the mare's leg, applying the liniment and wrapping it carefully, Harold found himself talking to the horse as naturally as he might have spoken to an old friend. "Name's Harold Mason," he said. "Been up here most of my life. Had a proper farm once. Nothing fancy, but it was something." His fingers worked methodically despite the arthritis. Grew hay and some vegetables, raised a few cattle, had 2 good workhorses, Samson and Delilah. Nothing as fine as you, though. The mare stood patiently, occasionally shifting her weight but otherwise allowing him to work. The foals had grown bolder, cautiously exploring the perimeter of the room, sniffing at the worn furniture and old photographs on the mantelpiece. "Careful there," Harold warned, as one foal nudged a framed photo of Martha. "That's precious cargo." He finished wrapping the mare's leg and stood back to examine his work. "That'll have to do. Should keep it stable at least." The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. He had 3 horses in his cabin with a blizzard bearing down, and his supplies were already stretched thin for 1 elderly human, let alone 3 large animals. "You all must be hungry," he said, moving to the kitchen. "Don't have proper feed, but let's see what I can put together." In the pantry, Harold found half a sack of oats he used for his morning porridge, some withered apples, and a few carrots that had seen better days. He filled his largest cooking pot with water and set it on the wood stove to warm, then mixed in a generous portion of the oats. "It's not what you're used to, I expect," he told the mare as he placed the pot on the floor. "But it's warm and filling." The mare approached cautiously, sniffed the improvised feed, then began to eat with obvious hunger. Harold sliced the apples and carrots, offering pieces to the foals, who accepted them eagerly once they saw their mother eating. As the horses ate, Harold took stock of his situation. The wind had picked up outside, howling around the cabin's eaves and rattling the windows. The storm had arrived earlier than predicted. They were all trapped here now, at least until the worst passed. "You picked the right door, I suppose," he told the mare. "Next farm's 15 miles down the valley, and they're not particularly kind to strays." He thought of the Hendersons with their reputation for harsh treatment of animals. "You wouldn't have made it there anyway, not in this weather, and with those little ones." After the horses finished eating, the mare settled awkwardly onto the braided rug before the fireplace, her injured leg extended carefully. The foals immediately curled up against her, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Harold watched in fascination as the 3 white horses, so wildly out of place in his humble cabin, seemed to make themselves at home. The scene stirred something in his memory. "Martha used to read this story," he said quietly, more to himself than to the horses, "about a magical white horse that would appear to those in need. Can't remember what it was called now." Watching the firelight play across their white coats, Harold could almost believe there was something magical about these animals. Their appearance on this particular day, the anniversary of Martha's passing, though he hadn't mentioned that aloud, seemed too coincidental. Harold settled into his worn armchair, wincing at the familiar pain in his back. In the warm glow of the fire, with the storm raging outside and 3 unexpected guests dozing nearby, he felt a strange contentment that had been absent from his life for too long. "Don't know where you came from," he told the sleeping horses, "or why you chose my door, but you're welcome to stay until you're healed up." The mare opened one eye, regarding him with that same uncanny intelligence, then closed it again in what Harold could have sworn was a gesture of gratitude. As evening deepened into night, Harold dozed in his chair, lulled by the crackling fire and the soft breathing of the horses. He dreamed of Martha, young and vibrant, standing in a field of wildflowers with a white horse beside her. She was smiling at him, that knowing smile that always meant she understood something he hadn't yet grasped. "They found you," Dream Martha said, her voice as clear as if she were really there. "Just like I knew they would." Harold startled awake, the dream fading but leaving a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He looked at the sleeping horses and wondered, not for the last time, what strange twist of fate had brought them to his door. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside Harold Mason's cabin, an unexpected peace had taken hold. Harold woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar sounds in his cabin. The first pale light of dawn filtered through frost-covered windows, illuminating the impossible scene before him. 3 white horses in his living room. So it hadn't been a dream after all. The mare was already awake, her dark eyes watching him quietly. The foals remained curled against her, small chests rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Outside, the wind had died down, but through the window, Harold could see that at least another foot of snow had fallen overnight. They were well and truly snowed in now. "Morning," Harold said to the mare, his voice rough with sleep. "Hope you don't mind if I get the fire going again." He rose stiffly from the chair where he'd spent the night, his old bones protesting the awkward sleeping position. Moving carefully around the horses, he added logs to the dying embers and stirred them until flames licked upward once more. The mare watched his every movement with that same unnerving intelligence. Harold's gaze fell on the mare's injured leg. The bandage had slipped during the night, and he could see swelling above where the wrap ended. "That needs more attention," he muttered. "And I reckon we all need breakfast." In the kitchen, Harold assessed his supplies with growing concern. The oats were now half gone, used up in last night's improvised horse feed. His own stores were meager, some flour, beans, canned vegetables, and a small amount of salt pork. He'd planned to make a trip into town before the storm hit, but the horses' arrival had disrupted that plan. "Going to be tight," he told the mare as he mixed more oats with water, "but we'll manage somehow." As he set the pot down for the horses, Harold noticed something odd. The cabin floor, which should have been a mess from 3 horses spending the night indoors, was surprisingly clean. No droppings, no mess of any kind. He looked at the mare questioningly. "Well, aren't you something special?" he said. "House-trained horses, that's a first." After the horses ate, Harold rewrapped the mare's leg with fresh liniment. "You need a name," he said as he worked. "Can't keep calling you mare or girl." He studied her pristine white coat, the unusual silver white of her mane. "How about Luna? Seems fitting for one as pale as the moon." The horse gently tossed her head, and Harold chuckled. "Luna it is, then." He looked at the foals, who were now exploring the cabin with more confidence. "And for you two, how about Stella and Nova? All keeping with the celestial theme." The bolder of the 2 foals, Nova, Harold decided, approached him and nudged his hand with her soft muzzle. The gesture filled him with an unexpected warmth. "Been a while since anything relied on me," he told her quietly. With the horses fed and tended to, Harold fixed himself a simple breakfast of coffee and toast. As he ate, he contemplated his unusual situation. The rational part of his mind insisted he should be worried about his dwindling supplies, about the damage 3 horses might do to his cabin, about where these animals had come from and who might be looking for them. But instead, he felt a curious calm, as if the horse's presence was somehow meant to be. After breakfast, Harold bundled up and ventured outside to check conditions. The world had been transformed into a vast white expanse, with snowdrifts taller than Harold himself in places. The path to the chicken coop was completely buried, and it took him nearly an hour to dig his way there, feed the chickens, and collect the few eggs they had laid. By the time he returned to the cabin, sweating despite the cold, the horses had arranged themselves comfortably by the fire. Luna lay on her side, allowing the foals to nurse. The scene was so peaceful, so natural that Harold paused in the doorway, reluctant to disturb them. "Suppose we're stuck with each other for a few days at least," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "That drift by the north corner is nearly 6 feet high. No way we're getting out until some of this melts, or I can dig a proper path." Luna lifted her head and nickered softly, as if in agreement. Throughout the day, Harold busied himself with small tasks around the cabin, repairing a loose shutter, patching a draft by the window, taking inventory of his supplies. The horses watched him work, their presence transforming the lonely routine into something companionable. Occasionally, the foals would follow him from room to room, curious about his activities. By mid-afternoon, Harold had settled into his armchair with an old book, one of Martha's favorites. It was a collection of folktales and legends, and he found himself thumbing through it, searching for the stories she used to read about the white horse. The foals had fallen asleep by the fire, but Luna remained alert, her gaze following him as he turned the pages. "Here it is," Harold said finally, his finger tracing the words on the yellowed page. "The white mare of blessing. Says here that in Celtic legend, a pure white mare would sometimes appear to those in dire need, bringing with her gifts of healing and renewal." He glanced up at Luna. The mare would only appear to those with pure hearts who had suffered great loss. Luna held his gaze steadily, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Bunch of nonsense, of course," Harold said, closing the book. "Just an old story." But even as he said it, he felt a tingle of doubt. There was something extraordinary about these horses, something he couldn't quite explain. As evening approached once more, Harold prepared another meal from his dwindling supplies. He found himself talking to the horses as he worked, telling them about his life with Martha, about the farm in its better days, about his regrets and hopes. It had been so long since he'd spoken this much, and though the horses couldn't answer, they seemed to listen with an attention that encouraged him to continue. "Martha always wanted children," he told Luna as he stirred a pot of bean soup. "Never happened for us, though. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if we'd had a family. Might have kept the farm going, might not be so alone now." Luna rose from her place by the fire and approached him, gently bumping his shoulder with her nose. The gesture was so tender, so seemingly deliberate, that Harold felt tears spring to his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, not entirely sure what he was thanking her for. That night, as the temperature outside plummeted and the wind picked up once more, Harold and the 3 white horses settled by the fire in what had already become a familiar routine. There was something profoundly comforting about their presence, something that eased the chronic loneliness that had been Harold's constant companion since Martha's death. As he drifted towards sleep, Harold wondered again where these mysterious animals had come from, and why they had appeared at his door on this of all days. But whatever the reason, he was grateful they had found him. Days melted into one another as the storm continued its assault on the mountains. Harold had lived through many harsh winters, but this one seemed determined to test the limits of endurance. The radio, when he could get reception, reported record snowfall across the region, with roads closed and communities isolated. But inside the cabin, a curious warmth had taken hold that defied the howling winds outside. Harold found himself falling into an easy rhythm with his equine guests. Each morning he would wake to find Luna already alert, watching over her sleeping foals. He would rebuild the fire, prepare their food, and check Luna's injured leg, which was healing with remarkable speed. "Never seen anything mend so quickly," Harold told her on the 4th morning as he removed the wrap to find the swelling almost completely gone. "You've got good healing in your blood." The hours that might have dragged in lonely isolation now passed comfortably in the horse's company. Harold read aloud from his small collection of books, told stories of his younger days, and even sang occasionally, old folk songs that Martha had loved. The horses seemed to appreciate the music, especially the foals, who would perk up their ears and sometimes prance in small circles as if dancing. It was during one such impromptu concert that Harold noticed something odd. As he sang an old ballad about a sailor lost at sea, Stella, the quieter of the two foals, approached his chair and gently pressed her muzzle against his chest directly over his heart. The touch was so deliberate that Harold stopped mid-verse. "What is it, girl?" he asked. Stella maintained the gentle pressure for a moment longer, then stepped back. Harold suddenly realized that the persistent ache in his chest, a combination of grief and the angina that had troubled him for years, had momentarily subsided. He placed his hand where the foal's muzzle had been and felt nothing but warmth where there had been pain. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, looking from Stella to Luna, who was watching the interaction with those knowing eyes. Later that day, as Harold prepared a simple stew from his dwindling supplies, he found himself pondering the strange encounter. "Martha always said animals could sense things we couldn't," he told Luna, who had taken to standing nearby whenever he cooked, as if supervising. "Said they could feel pain and heal it too in their way." Luna nickered softly in what seemed like agreement. "Course Martha believed in all sorts of things I couldn't see," Harold continued, stirring the pot. "Angels and spirits and such. Used to tease her about it, though I was gentler after her cancer diagnosis. Figured she needed whatever comfort she could find." He tasted the stew, added a pinch of salt from his precious supply. "She told me something strange near the end. Said she'd be sending me help when I needed it most, that I shouldn't be alone forever." He glanced at Luna. "Don't suppose you're what she meant?" The mare held his gaze with such human-like understanding that Harold felt a shiver run down his spine. He shook his head, laughing quietly at himself. "Listen to me. Talking to a horse like she can understand. Loneliness does strange things to a man's mind." But as the days passed, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that there was something extraordinary about these animals. They were too clean, too intelligent, too attuned to his needs. Nova would bring him his reading glasses when he misplaced them, nudging them toward him with her nose. Stella would stand beside him when his joints ached, offering her warmth. And Luna seemed to anticipate his movements around the cabin, always shifting to make space exactly when he needed it. On the 7th day after the horse's arrival, Harold awoke to silence. The constant background roar of the wind had finally ceased. When he looked out the window, he saw a clear blue sky and sunlight glittering on the vast white landscape. The storm had passed. "Looks like we made it through," he told the horses as he prepared their morning oats, the last of his supply. "Roads should be cleared in a day or two." The thought brought with it an unexpected pang. Once the roads were passable, he would need to figure out what to do about the horses. They couldn't stay in his cabin forever, but the idea of them leaving left him feeling hollow. "Got to be practical," he muttered to himself. "Could try to find your owners, I suppose," he said to Luna. "Though no one's reported missing horses that I've heard on the radio. Could call the ranger station, see if they know of any wild herds in the area." Luna tossed her head in what seemed like disagreement. "Not wild, then?" Harold asked, then laughed at himself again. "Look at me, having a conversation with a horse. Martha would say I've finally gone round the bend." But his laughter faded as he remembered something. Crossing to the old roll-top desk in the corner, Harold pulled out a worn leather journal, Martha's diary, which he had never been able to bring himself to read after her death. Something compelled him to open it now. He flipped through the pages until he reached entries from her final months. Martha's handwriting had grown shakier as her illness progressed, but her words remained clear and determined. He scanned the pages until a particular passage caught his eye. "Harold doesn't believe me when I tell him about the dreams. Every night now I see them, 3 white horses in a snowy forest. The mare speaks to me without words, tells me she will watch over him when I'm gone. I know it sounds like the medication talking, but these dreams feel more real than my waking hours. The horses are waiting for the right moment." I've asked them to give him time to grieve, but not to let him fade away in loneliness. They've promised they'll come." Harold's hands trembled as he read the words. He looked up at Luna, who was watching him intently. Did Martha send you?" The mare stepped forward and bowed her head, touching her muzzle to the open pages of the diary. When she raised her head again, her eyes seemed to hold all the love and wisdom that Harold had seen in Martha's eyes during their 40 years together. "That's not possible," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it was true. Somehow, some way, Martha had kept her promise. That night, as they gathered by the fire, Harold felt a peace he hadn't known since before Martha's illness. Whether the horses were truly supernatural or simply extraordinary animals who had somehow found their way to his door when he needed them most, he didn't know. But he was certain of one thing: they had been meant to find him. "Thank you," he told Luna as she settled beside his chair. "For whatever this is, thank you." Luna rested her great head against his knee, and Harold felt the last of his doubt melt away like snow in the sun. The morning after the storm broke, Harold woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Outside, the sun transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling sea of diamonds. It was cold. The thermometer outside his window read 15 below zero, but the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. "Beautiful day," he told the horses as he prepared their breakfast. His supplies were critically low now, just enough for maybe one more day. "Think it's time we all got some fresh air and exercise, and I need to figure out what to do with you three." After they'd eaten, Harold bundled up in his warmest clothes and opened the cabin door. The horses seemed eager to go outside, though Luna hesitated at the threshold, looking back at Harold as if checking that he was coming too. "Don't worry, I'm right behind you," he assured her. The snow in front of the cabin had drifted into smooth, undulating waves. It was nearly waist-deep in places, but Luna forged ahead, creating a path that the foals and Harold could follow more easily. Harold watched in amazement as the 3 white horses moved through the white landscape, their coats so pristine they almost disappeared against the snow. Only their dark eyes and the steam from their nostrils gave them away. Harold trudged through the snow toward the old barn. He needed to assess the damage from last winter and see if any part of it could be made habitable for the horses. He couldn't keep them in his cabin indefinitely, but the thought of them leaving made his chest tighten with a familiar ache. Luna seemed to understand his intentions, following him to the barn without being led. The structure was in worse shape than Harold remembered. Half the roof had collapsed under last year's snow load, and what remained sagged dangerously. The walls leaned at precarious angles, and the door hung from a single rusted hinge. "Not much shelter here," Harold muttered, disappointed. He'd been putting off the inevitable repairs for too long, telling himself it didn't matter since he no longer kept livestock. Now he regretted that neglect. Luna nickered softly and moved past him into the barn. She carefully picked her way through the debris to the corner, least affected by the collapse. There, a small area about 12 feet square remained relatively intact, with roof and walls still standing. Luna pawed at the ground, clearing away some of the debris. "You think this could work?" Harold asked, surveying the space. "With some cleanup and temporary repairs, it might provide basic shelter." "It'll take some doing, but you might be right." Over the next few hours, Harold worked harder than he had in years, clearing fallen beams and debris from the corner of the barn. The horses helped in their way. Luna used her strength to push aside heavier pieces that Harold couldn't manage alone, while the foals seemed to delight in carrying smaller items in their mouths to a pile outside. When his arthritic joints forced him to take a break, Harold sat on a relatively intact hay bale and watched the horses explore the cleared space. Despite the cold, he felt warmer than he had in ages, invigorated by the physical work and the strange companionship. "You're good for me," he told Luna as she came to stand beside him. "Haven't worked like this since before Martha got sick." Luna gently rested her head on his shoulder, and Harold found himself unconsciously reaching up to stroke her neck. The gesture felt so natural, as if they'd been companions for years rather than days. By midday, Harold had cleared enough space to create a serviceable shelter within the damaged barn. It wasn't ideal, but with the addition of some old tarps he found in a storage chest and some careful reinforcement of the remaining structure, it would keep the worst of the elements out. It struck him that he was putting more care into this temporary shelter than he had into maintaining his own cabin in recent years. "Guess I needed something to care about," he admitted to himself. As the sun began its early winter descent, Harold reluctantly headed back to the cabin, the horses following. His muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, but it was a satisfying pain, the kind that came from purposeful work rather than the grinding discomfort of old age and neglect. Inside the warm cabin, Harold tuned the radio to the local station, hoping for news about road conditions. The static-filled broadcast confirmed what he already suspected. The main roads were being cleared, but it would be at least another day before the more remote routes, including the one to his cabin, would be passable. "One more day," he told the horses, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that they could stay a bit longer, anxiety about what would happen after that. That evening, as he prepared their meals from the last of his supplies, Harold found himself talking through his options aloud. "Could try to find your original owners if you have any, but no one's reported missing horses on the radio." He looked at Luna questioningly. "Are you wild? Part of one of the mountain herds?" Luna tossed her head in what seemed like negation. "Didn't think so. You're too comfortable around humans," he sighed, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "Could call animal control, but they'd probably just take you to auction, or maybe the wildlife department." None of the options felt right. As darkness fell outside and the temperature dropped further, Harold added extra logs to the fire. The horses arranged themselves comfortably in what had become their usual spots, Luna closest to Harold's chair, the foals curled together nearby. Harold picked up Martha's diary again, turning to the final entries. Her last words, written just days before her death, caught his eye. "The white mare came to me again in my dreams last night. She showed me a vision of Harold, not alone and withering as I feared, but surrounded by new life, his heart healing. The mare told me to trust that they will find him when the time is right, and that they will know what he needs even if he doesn't. I believe her. It gives me peace to know he won't be alone forever." Harold closed the diary, tears blurring his vision. He looked at Luna, who was watching him with those impossibly knowing eyes. "Martha sent you, didn't she? Somehow, some way." The mare rose and stepped toward him, placing her muzzle directly over his heart, as Stella had done days earlier. This time, Harold felt a warmth spread through his chest, dissolving the constant ache of grief and loneliness that had been his companion for 3 long years. "What are you?" he whispered, but he already knew the answer wouldn't come in words he could understand. That night, as Harold drifted toward sleep in his chair, he felt more at peace than he had since Martha's diagnosis. Whatever tomorrow might bring, whatever decisions he would have to make about the horses, he now understood that their appearance at his door had not been random chance. They had come for him, sent by a love that transcended death itself. And for the first time in years, Harold slept without dreams of loss. Morning brought the distant rumble of heavy machinery. Harold recognized the sound immediately, the county snowplow working its way up the mountain road. By afternoon, the first vehicles would likely make it through. "Sounds like our isolation is coming to an end," Harold told the horses as he prepared their breakfast, the last of his oats mixed with some crushed crackers to stretch the meal. Luna nickered softly in response, her ears perked toward the sound. Harold's own stomach growled loudly. He'd been rationing his food, giving priority to the horses, especially the growing foals. His pantry now stood empty, except for a few cans of beans and some stale crackers. He needed supplies desperately, but the thought of leaving the horses alone even briefly made him uneasy. After breakfast, Harold and the horses returned to the barn to continue their work. The partial repairs he'd made yesterday were holding, but there was still much to do. With Luna's help, Harold managed to drag several fallen support beams into position, reinforcing the sagging roof. He worked with renewed vigor, ignoring the protests of his arthritic joints. "We'll have this place habitable in no time," he told Nova, who was enthusiastically dragging small branches and debris outside. The foal pranced around him playfully, her movements full of grace and energy that made Harold smile despite his exhaustion. By midday, the sound of an engine approaching caught their attention. Harold looked up from his work to see an old blue pickup truck carefully navigating the snow-packed drive to his cabin. He recognized it immediately, Bill Peterson, his nearest neighbor, who lived 5 miles down the mountain. "Stay here," Harold told the horses, dusting off his clothes. "I'll handle this." Bill was a good man, but notoriously nosy and not particularly gentle with animals. Harold didn't want him barging into the barn and startling the horses, especially not before he'd figured out how to explain their presence. "Harold," Bill called as he climbed out of his truck. A stocky man in his 50s with a thick beard and perpetually suspicious eyes, Bill had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of the mountain community. "Been trying to reach you on the radio for days. Started to think maybe you'd frozen to death up here." "Takes more than a blizzard to finish me off," Harold replied, extending a hand in greeting. "Good to see you, Bill." "Brought you some supplies," Bill said, gesturing to the back of his truck. "Figure you must be running low by now." "That's mighty thoughtful. I'm down to my last can of beans." As they unloaded boxes of food and other necessities, Bill kept glancing around curiously. "Saw some unusual tracks coming up here. Big ones. You got company I don't know about?" Harold hesitated. He wasn't ready to share the horses, not until he understood more about their nature and purpose. But the tracks in the snow were undeniable evidence. "Found some strays during the storm," he said finally, deciding a partial truth was better than an outright lie. 3 horses, lost in the blizzard. Been keeping them safe until I can figure out where they belong." Bill's eyebrows shot up. "Horses? Where are you keeping them? Not in that death trap you call a barn, I hope." "Been fixing it up," Harold said defensively. "Got a corner that's sound enough for temporary shelter." "Well, I'll be," Bill said, shaking his head. "Harold Mason taking in strays and fixing up his place. Martha would be pleased to see it." His expression softened at the mention of Martha, whom he'd always respected. "What kind of horses?" "White ones," Harold said simply. "Mare and 2 foals." Bill frowned. "White horses? That's odd. Nobody around here keeps white horses that I know of. The wild herds are mostly pintos and bays." He scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Come to think of it, I did hear something strange on the radio this morning. Some rich fella from the city lost 3 valuable white show horses about 2 weeks back, during that first storm, offering a big reward for their return." Harold felt his heart sink. "Show horses? From the city?" "Yeah, some fancy Arabian bloodline. Worth a small fortune, apparently. Been all over the news in the valley. Owner's some investment banker who keeps a vacation home about 20 miles south. Claims they broke out of their paddock during the storm." Harold tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside a war was raging. Luna and the foals didn't behave like ordinary horses, let alone pampered show animals, and the timing of their appearance, on the anniversary of Martha's death after her prophetic diary entries, couldn't be coincidence. "Doesn't sound like my strays," he said finally. These seem more like wild mountain horses to me. Bill shrugged. Well, might be worth checking out anyway. That reward money could fix up a lot more than just your barn, Harold. After helping Harold store the supplies, Bill insisted on seeing the horses. Harold reluctantly led him to the barn, his stomach knotting with anxiety. What if Bill recognized them as the missing show horses? What if he reported them to the rich owner? As they approached the barn, Harold whispered under his breath, "Please just be ordinary horses for a few minutes." When they entered the repaired corner of the barn, Bill let out a low whistle. Luna and the foals stood calmly in the cleared space, their white coats gleaming even in the dim light. "Beautiful animals," Bill murmured. "But they don't look like Arabians to me. Wrong build entirely. More like those old workhorses your grandfather used to keep, Percherons, weren't they?" Relief flooded through Harold. "Something like that," he agreed quickly. Bill approached Luna cautiously, hand extended. The mare allowed him to touch her briefly, but there was a reserve in her manner that hadn't been present with Harold. The foals stayed behind their mother, watching Bill with wary eyes. "Seem healthy enough," Bill observed, stepping back, "but you'll need proper feed for them. I can bring some hay tomorrow if you'd like." "I'd appreciate that," Harold said sincerely. After Bill left, promising to return the next day with hay and more news about the missing show horses, Harold returned to the barn. Luna approached him immediately, nuzzling his shoulder as if in reassurance. "He didn't recognize you," Harold told her, stroking her neck. "But someone's looking for white horses. What if they come here? What if they try to take you away?" The thought filled him with a dread so profound, it nearly took his breath away. In just over a week, these mysterious creatures had become essential to him. The idea of losing them, of returning to his lonely existence, was unbearable. Luna lowered her head, her dark eyes meeting his with that uncanny intelligence. In their depths, Harold saw not fear but certainty, as if she knew something he didn't about what was to come. "I won't let anyone take you," he promised her. "Whatever you are, wherever you came from, you're home now." True to his word, Bill returned the next day with a truckload of hay and a sack of proper horse feed. "On loan until you figure out what to do with them," he insisted when Harold tried to pay him. "Though I reckon they're doing you as much good as you're doing them. Haven't seen you this lively in years." Harold couldn't deny it. The horses had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Martha's passing, a will to live rather than merely exist. Each morning he rose with purpose, his thoughts centered on their care and comfort rather than the empty hours ahead. After helping unload the supplies, Bill handed Harold a folded newspaper. "Thought you might want to see this. That fella I mentioned is getting desperate about his missing horses, doubled the reward." Harold unfolded the paper to find a large advertisement with a photograph of 3 white horses, a mare and 2 foals. His heart skipped a beat as he studied the image. These horses were undeniably white, but something about them was different. Their builds were lighter, more delicate than Luna and her foals. Their faces more refined, with a distinctive dished profile characteristic of Arabian bloodlines. "Not the same horses," Harold said, relief evident in his voice. Bill peered at the photo. "You sure? White horses are pretty rare around here. Look at the face shape, the build. These are Arabians, like you said. Mine are heavier. Workhorses." Bill shrugged. "If you say so. Still, might be worth a call. $10,000 is a lot of money for a man in your position." After Bill left, Harold returned to the barn where Luna and the foals were contentedly eating their new hay. He showed Luna the newspaper. "These aren't you, are they? You're something else entirely." Luna looked at the paper, then at Harold, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that continued to unnerve and comfort him in equal measure. She gently took the edge of the newspaper in her teeth and pulled it from his hands, dropping it to the ground and covering it with a hoof. Harold laughed. "Message received. Not your concern. That night, a strange restlessness kept Harold from sleep. He sat by the fire, Martha's diary open on his lap, reading and rereading her final entries about the white horses in her dreams. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, and a light snow was falling. Not another blizzard, just winter's gentle reminder of its presence. A soft tapping at the door roused him from his thoughts. Assuming it was Luna checking on him as she sometimes did, Harold opened the door without hesitation. But instead of the mare, he found a woman standing on his porch. Harold blinked in confusion. It was nearly midnight in the middle of winter, miles from the nearest neighbor. Yet here stood a slender woman with silver white hair that cascaded down her back. She wore only a simple white dress, seemingly impervious to the cold. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Harold asked, his voice catching. There was something familiar about her face, though he was certain they'd never met. "May I come in, Harold?" she asked, her voice melodic and warm. Startled that she knew his name, Harold hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "Of course. It's freezing out there. Are you lost? How did you get here?" The woman smiled as she entered, bringing with her a scent of wildflowers that had no business existing in the depths of winter. "I'm exactly where I need to be." She moved to the fire with the same grace Harold had observed in Luna, warming her hands, though she showed no signs of being cold. Her presence filled the cabin with a strange, peaceful energy. "Do I know you?" Harold asked, studying her face. "In a way," she replied enigmatically. "I've come about the horses." Harold's guard immediately went up. "What about them?" "You've been caring for them, healing them. I wanted to thank you for that." "Are they yours?" Harold asked, a knot forming in his stomach at the thought of having to give them up. The woman laughed, a sound like silver bells. "No, Harold. They belong to no one and everyone. They are guardians, healers. They appear to those who need them most. Like in Martha's book, The White Mare of Blessing." "Yes," she nodded. "Stories often contain more truth than people realize. Your wife understood that." The casual mention of Martha sent a jolt through Harold. "How do you know about my wife?" The woman's expression softened. "The mare was with her at the end, Harold. Not in physical form, but in spirit. Martha wasn't alone in her final moments." Harold sank into his chair, overwhelmed. "Who are you? What are you?" "A messenger," she said simply. "I've come to tell you that you don't need to fear losing them. The horses will stay as long as they're needed, as long as you need them. And the man looking for his missing Arabians, he will find what he lost, but it is not what waits in your barn." Harold's mind raced, struggling to process what was happening. Was this woman real, or had he fallen asleep by the fire and dreamed her up? How can I believe any of this? The woman approached him, kneeling gracefully beside his chair. Up close, her eyes were the same deep, knowing brown as Luna's. "Martha asked me to tell you something only she would know." Harold's breath caught. "What?" "On your last anniversary together, when she was too weak to leave her bed, you brought the mountain to her. You filled her room with wildflowers and pine branches. You played recordings of birdsong in the creek behind your property. You danced alone beside her bed to the song from your wedding. She said it was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her." Tears filled Harold's eyes. He had told no one about that day, that private moment between husband and wife. "That's true," he whispered. The woman rose. "The horses are a gift, Harold, from Martha, from the universe, from whatever power you choose to believe in. They've come to heal you, to remind you that life continues even after great loss. They'll stay until that healing is complete. And then they'll move on to someone else who needs them. But that time is not yet near." She moved toward the door. Harold rose to follow, 1,000 questions on his lips, but something told him she wouldn't answer them all tonight. "Rest now," she said, her hand on the doorknob. "The mare will explain what she can in her way." "Will I see you again?" Harold asked. The woman smiled, and in that smile, Harold caught a glimpse of Martha, not as she had been in her final days, weak and in pain, but as she had been in her prime, radiant and full of life. "I'm never far," she said. And then she was gone, stepping into the snowy night and disappearing as if she had never been. Harold stood at the open door for a long moment, the cold air filling his lungs. When he finally closed it and returned to his chair, he noticed that Martha's diary had fallen open to a page he hadn't seen before. In handwriting stronger than her final entries, she had written, "The white lady comes with the horses. She speaks for them when understanding is needed most. She bridges worlds. Listen to her, Harold, when she comes." Dawn arrived with a clarity that seemed to mirror the one taking root in Harold's mind. The events of the night before, the mysterious woman's visit, her impossible knowledge of his private moments with Martha, her revelations about the horses, should have left him questioning his sanity. Instead, Harold felt a profound sense of peace as he went about his morning routine. When he entered the barn with breakfast for the horses, Luna greeted him with the same knowing look he'd seen in the silver-haired woman's eyes. "It was real, wasn't it?" he asked the mare. "She was real, and so are you. More than just horses." Luna nickered softly and bowed her head as if in confirmation. "I don't understand it all," Harold continued, stroking her neck. "But I don't need to, do I? Martha always said I overthought things. Said sometimes you just need to accept the gift without questioning where it came from." The Foals approached, nuzzling his hands for their breakfast. Harold laughed, the sound echoing in the rafters of the old barn. How long had it been since he'd laughed like that? Since before Martha's diagnosis, at least. As the days passed, Harold found himself accepting the miraculous nature of his equine companions. He noticed changes in himself that went beyond the physical revival brought by daily work and purpose. The persistent ache in his chest had faded. The grief that had been his constant companion for 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something gentler, a wistful remembrance rather than a crushing weight. Most notably, Harold began to engage with the world again. When Bill visited, Harold invited him in for coffee instead of hurrying him on his way. When the phone rang, a rare occurrence, he answered it rather than letting it go to the machine. And when Maggie from the general store radioed to ask if he needed anything delivered, he found himself requesting not just necessities, but small luxuries he hadn't bothered with in years. Real coffee instead of instant, a novel from the shop's small lending library, even a bottle of decent whiskey. "Seems like you're coming back to life up here," Maggie commented when she delivered his order. Her eyes strayed curiously to the barn where the white horses were visible through the open door. "Bill told me about your strays. They're beautiful." "They are," Harold agreed, surprising himself by adding, "Would you like to meet them?" Maggie's face lit up. "I'd love to." As they walked to the barn, Harold found himself chatting easily with Maggie in a way he hadn't done with anyone since Martha's passing. He told her about finding the horses in the blizzard, about Luna's injured leg and how quickly it had healed, about the foal's playful antics. He left out the more inexplicable aspects, the woman's visit, Martha's diary entries, his growing conviction that the horses were more than ordinary animals. In the barn, Luna and the foals greeted Maggie with a friendliness that surprised Harold. Typically, they were reserved with visitors, as they had been with Bill. But they approached Maggie readily, allowing her to stroke their necks and muzzles. "They like you," Harold observed. Maggie smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Animals always do," My husband used to say I had a way with them. Harold remembered then that Maggie had lost her husband to cancer as well, just a year before Martha's diagnosis. They had attended her husband's funeral, but afterward, in his own grief, he'd failed to check in on her. Shame washed over him as he realized how self-absorbed he'd become. "I'm sorry I haven't been more neighborly these past few years," he said quietly. Maggie's eyes met his with understanding. "Grief takes us each differently, Harold. No apology needed." As she prepared to leave, Maggie paused. "You know, there's a community dinner at the church hall next Saturday. First one since before the big storm. You should come. Bring yourself back into the fold." Harold's first instinct was to decline, to retreat back into his solitude, but something, perhaps the gentle nudge of Luna's muzzle against his back, made him reconsider. "I might just do that," he said, surprising himself again. After Maggie left, Harold returned to the barn where Luna stood watching him intently. "You're changing me," he told the mare. "All of you. Healing me, like the woman said." That night, as Harold sat by the fire reading his borrowed novel, a sound outside drew his attention. Moving to the window, he saw Luna standing in the yard, her white coat luminous in the moonlight. She was looking toward the forest, her posture alert. The foals were nowhere to be seen. Concerned, Harold pulled on his coat and boots and went outside. "Luna? What is it, girl?" The mare turned to him briefly, then looked back at the tree line. Following her gaze, Harold saw movement in the shadows. His pulse quickened. A mountain lion, perhaps, or a wolf drawn by the scent of horses. But what emerged from the trees was neither predator nor threat. It was another horse, an old stallion, his once white coat now grayed with age. He moved slowly, with the careful steps of an animal in pain or illness. Luna nickered softly, a sound of welcome and concern. The stallion responded with a weak whicker of his own, continuing his labored progress toward them. "Another one?" Harold whispered, awestruck. "Is he like you?" Luna moved forward to meet the stallion, greeting him with a gentle touch of muzzles. Then she looked back at Harold, her message clear. "Help him." Harold approached slowly, noting the stallion's condition. He was dangerously thin, his ribs visible beneath his dull coat. One leg showed signs of an old injury, poorly healed. His eyes, though clouded with age, held the same intelligence Harold had come to recognize in Luna. "Hello, old fellow," Harold said gently, extending his hand. The stallion sniffed it cautiously, then pressed his muzzle into Harold's palm with a sigh that seemed to contain years of weariness. "You're safe now," Harold promised, stroking the stallion's neck. "We'll take care of you." As he led the newcomer toward the barn, Luna walking supportively on the stallion's other side, Harold felt a deepening sense that he was part of something larger than himself, something he couldn't fully understand, but could accept with an open heart. Inside the barn, the foals greeted the stallion with curious sniffs and gentle nudges. Harold quickly prepared a space with fresh hay and water, then examined the stallion more thoroughly. Beyond his malnourishment and the old leg injury, the horse seemed remarkably sound for his apparent age. "You've been on a long journey, haven't you?" Harold murmured, running his hands over the stallion's prominent bones. "But you're home now." As if understanding, the stallion lowered his head and closed his eyes, the tension visibly draining from his body. For the first time, Harold noticed a peculiar marking on the horse's withers, a pattern in the hair that, when looked at just right, resembled a handprint. Martha's handprint. Harold's hand trembled as he traced the outline of the mark on the stallion's withers. It couldn't be Martha's handprint. That was impossible. And yet, the resemblance was uncanny, down to the slightly crooked little finger that had been broken in a childhood accident and never set properly. "Martha?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The stallion turned his head, regarding Harold with eyes that held a depth of understanding no ordinary animal could possess. Beside them, Luna nickered softly, as if encouraging Harold to make the connection that hovered just beyond his grasp. Harold stepped back, his mind racing. The mysterious woman's words echoed in his memory. The mare was with her at the end, not in physical form, but in spirit. What if it wasn't just the mare? What if Martha's connection to these extraordinary creatures went deeper than he had imagined? That night, Harold slept in the barn, unwilling to leave the exhausted stallion alone. Luna and the foals settled nearby, creating a protective circle around the newcomer. In the lantern light, Harold studied the 4 white horses, marveling at how his life had transformed in just 2 weeks. From isolation and grief to whatever this was, a miracle perhaps, or madness. But if it was madness, it was the most peaceful kind he could imagine. Morning brought renewed energy to the stallion. Though still thin and moving with the caution of age, his eyes were brighter, more alert. He accepted the feed Harold offered with good appetite and allowed himself to be groomed, leaning into the curry comb with obvious pleasure. "We need a name for you," Harold told him as he worked. "Can't just call you old fellow forever." The stallion turned his head, looking directly at a faded photograph pinned to the barn wall. It showed a much younger Harold standing proudly beside his first tractor, a used John Deere that Martha had called the beginning of the empire. Harold had named that tractor Spirit, believing it would embody the spirit of hard work and prosperity that would build their farm. "Spirit?" Harold asked, following the stallion's gaze. "Is that what you want to be called?" The horse nickered softly and nudged Harold's shoulder. "Spirit it is, then," Harold agreed, wondering not for the first time at the strange communication that seemed possible with these animals. As the week progressed, Harold divided his time between caring for the horses and preparing for the community dinner Maggie had invited him to. The prospect of socializing after so long in isolation both terrified and exhilarated him. He found his best flannel shirt, ironed it carefully, and even trimmed his beard, which had grown wild in recent years. "What do you think?" he asked Luna on Saturday afternoon, presenting himself for inspection. "Presentable enough for polite company?" The mare studied him, then deliberately nudged his chest pocket, where he kept Martha's wedding ring on a chain. Harold hadn't worn it since her passing, keeping it close but hidden, too painful a reminder to display openly. "You think I should wear it?" he asked, surprised. Luna's gaze was steady, insistent. With hesitant fingers, Harold withdrew the simple gold band on its chain. In the winter sunlight streaming through the barn window, it glowed with a warmth that seemed to reach into his chest. Slowly, he placed it around his neck, letting the ring rest against his heart where it belonged. "Thank you," he whispered to Luna. "You're right. She should be with me for this." Before leaving for the dinner, Harold checked on Spirit one last time. The old stallion was resting comfortably, the foals curled up beside him like grandchildren with a beloved grandfather. The sight filled Harold with contentment. "I'll be back in a few hours," he told them. "Behave yourselves." The community hall was warm and bright when Harold arrived, filled with neighbors he hadn't seen in months or even years. There was an awkward moment as conversation briefly paused at his entrance. Harold Mason, the recluse, emerging from his self-imposed exile, but then Maggie spotted him and hurried over. "Harold, you came." Her genuine pleasure at his presence eased his discomfort. "Come meet everyone. Some new folks moved in while you were playing hermit." As Maggie led him through the crowd, introducing him to new faces and reacquainting him with old ones, Harold felt a strange sensation, as if he was returning to life after a long hibernation. People asked about his cabin, about how he'd weathered the storm, and inevitably about the white horses that Bill and Maggie had mentioned to anyone who would listen. "Never figured you for a horse person," said Tom Jenkins, who ran the hardware store in town. "Especially not fancy white ones." They found me, not the other way around, Harold replied honestly. Best thing that's happened to me in years. The conversation flowed easily after that. Harold found himself sharing stories about the horses' antics, carefully editing out the more inexplicable aspects of their presence. He spoke of Luna's intelligence, the foal's playful spirits, and most recently, the arrival of the old stallion he'd named Spirit. 4 white horses now? Bill asked incredulously. And they just showed up at your door? That's mighty strange, Harold. Harold shrugged. Life is strange sometimes. Well, you're welcome to bring them to my place if you need more space, offered Sarah Williams, a widow who owned a small farm on the outskirts of town. My pastures are empty since I sold the last of my horses, and my barn's in good shape. That's very kind, Harold said, touched by the offer. But I think they're right where they need to be for now. As the evening progressed, Harold found himself drawn into the community in ways he hadn't experienced since before Martha's illness. He promised to attend the next town meeting, accepted an invitation to Sunday dinner at the pastor's house, and even agreed to help with repairs at the community center the following weekend. When it was time to leave, Maggie walked him to his truck. It's good to have you back among the living, Harold, she said softly. Martha would be pleased. Harold touched the ring beneath his shirt. I think she is, he replied. The drive home through the snowy landscape felt different somehow. The mountains that had seemed like prison walls now appeared protective, sheltering. The isolated cabin that had been his refuge from pain now beckoned as a place of healing and new beginnings. As he approached his property, Harold was startled to see lights glowing in the barn, soft golden lights that couldn't be explained by the single lantern he'd left burning. He parked quickly and hurried toward the barn, his heart racing with both fear and anticipation. What he found inside would change everything he thought he understood about life, death, and the mysterious white horses that had entered his world. Harold approached the barn cautiously, his breath creating clouds in the frosty air. The golden light spilled from every crack between the weathered boards, warm and inviting despite its strangeness. As he reached for the door, he hesitated, suddenly aware that whatever waited inside might forever change him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him defied explanation. The interior of the barn was transformed. The rough-hewn timbers, the patched roof, the earthen floor, all remained physically unchanged, yet they seemed to shimmer with an inner luminosity. And in the center of this gentle radiance stood the 4 white horses, their coats gleaming like freshly fallen snow, but they were not alone. The silver-haired woman from before was there, her white dress flowing around her as if stirred by a breeze Harold couldn't feel. Beside her stood another figure, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face who seemed vaguely familiar, though Harold couldn't place him. Welcome home, Harold, the woman said, her voice as melodic as he remembered. What's happening? Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Who are you really? Who is he? The woman smiled. You've opened your heart again, Harold. That's why we're here. That's why they came to you. She gestured to the horses, who stood quietly watching the exchange. I don't understand, Harold said, though part of him sensed the truth hovering just beyond conscious thought. The man stepped forward then, his movement fluid and graceful in a way that reminded Harold of Luna. You were closing yourself off from life, he said, his voice deep and resonant. After your Martha passed, you began to fade. The horses sensed it, we all did. We. Harold's gaze darted between the 2 figures, the impossible truth beginning to dawn on him. The woman's smile deepened. The white horses are guardians, Harold. They appear to those who need healing, yes, but they don't come alone. They are conduits, you might say, bridges between worlds. You're saying you're... Harold couldn't finish the sentence. Not ghosts, the man said quickly. Not exactly. More like messengers, echoes of those who once walked this earth and chose to remain connected to it, to help those in need. Like angels? Harold asked, the word feeling strange on his tongue. He'd never been particularly religious, despite Martha's gentle faith. If that word brings you comfort, the woman said, though we're not quite what your scriptures describe, we're simply souls who choose to stay and help. Harold's gaze was drawn to Spirit, the old stallion whose appearance had seemed so significant. And him? The mark on his withers. The woman approached Spirit, laying her hand gently on the exact spot where Martha's handprint seemed to be embedded in his coat. Spirit is special. Most who become messengers choose to return as human forms, or simply as presence, light, warmth, comfort. But a few choose the form of the white horses themselves. Harold's heart nearly stopped. Are you saying that Spirit is not Martha? The woman clarified quickly. But a messenger who knew her, who was with her at the end, who promised to watch over you. The mark is her signature, her way of letting you know she approved, that she's at peace. Harold moved toward Spirit as if drawn by an invisible thread. The stallion met his gaze steadily, those wise eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that transcended ordinary consciousness. Who was he? Harold whispered. When he was human? The man stepped forward. My name was Joseph Mason, your grandfather. Harold stared, memories flooding back of a kind, strong man who had taught him to farm, to respect the land, to care for animals. His grandfather had died when Harold was just 12, but the lessons had shaped his entire life. Grandpa Joe? Harold's voice cracked with emotion. The man, Joseph, nodded. I promised Martha I'd help watch over you. When she realized you were fading away, becoming a ghost while still alive, she reached out across the divide, asked for help. Harold turned to the woman. And you? Did I know you? She shook her head. Not in your lifetime. I lived on this land long before your family came to it, but I've watched over all who've dwelled here in my way. The White Lady. Harold breathed, remembering old stories his grandfather had told of a benevolent spirit said to protect the valley. Some have called me that, she acknowledged. Harold's mind raced, trying to process the impossible reality before him. But Luna and the Foals? Just horses, Joseph said with a gentle smile. Extraordinary ones, yes, special ones who work with us, who can perceive what most cannot. But still horses. They found you in the storm because they were guided to you, the woman explained. They needed shelter. You needed healing. A perfect match. Harold looked at Luna, who had moved to stand beside him, her warm presence grounding him in this surreal moment. And now, will they stay? That's for you to decide, the woman said. They're not bound to us. They can remain with you as ordinary horses. Well, as ordinary as such creatures can ever be, or they can move on when you no longer need them. And you? Will I see you again? Harold asked, looking between the two figures. Joseph smiled. We're never far, Harold, but our visible presence is rare, meant for moments of transition. You're healing now, finding your way back to the world of the living. Our work is nearly done. Martha, Harold began, then faltered, uncertain how to express the question in his heart. The woman seemed to understand. She's at peace, Harold. Her soul is not bound to this earth as ours are by choice and purpose. She's moved on to what comes next, but her love remains. It's in the sunrise that warms your face, the wildflowers that bloom in spring, the gentle rain that nourishes your garden. It's in every memory you cherish, and every moment of joy you allow yourself to feel. Tears flowed freely down Harold's weathered cheeks now, not tears of grief, as he had shed so many times before, but tears of release, of understanding, of acceptance. Thank you, he whispered, the words encompassing everything, the horses, the messengers, the gift of healing he had been given. The golden light began to fade, and with it, the distinct forms of Joseph and the woman. As they dimmed, Joseph's voice echoed one last time. "Live, Harold. That's all she ever wanted for you." And then they were gone, leaving Harold alone with the 4 white horses in a barn that was once again just a barn, patched and weathered, but somehow more beautiful for its imperfections. Luna nudged Harold's shoulder gently, bringing him back to the present moment. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars glittering like distant fires in the velvet sky. But inside, Harold felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, the warmth of a heart reopened to life, to connection, to possibility. "Well," he said to the horses, his voice steady despite the extraordinary experience, "looks like we're family now, all of us." And in that moment, Harold Mason understood the true gift the white horses had brought to his door on that snowy night, not just companionship or purpose, but the courage to live fully again, to honor Martha's memory not through isolation, but through engagement with the world she had so deeply loved. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the mountain in a blanket of pristine white, a new beginning, clean and full of promise.